The experts told us that it is impossible to organize a national election in the period of 4 months that we were given. They said you would need 18 months, preferably 2 years to do it.
We made a conclusion that we do not have a voters' roll. We must start from scratch, because in 1994 you voted as a citizen and people were given cards, but there was no national common voters' roll.
South Africa's transition from apartheid to democracy remains one of the most impressive political transitions of our time. It's a miracle story that almost didn't happen. The country's lack of multi-party electoral experience and the violent and persistent clashes between the ANC and the IFP are just some of the factors that stood to derail the process.
If they try to sideline us, South Africa will be a catastrophe. We are going to destroy. No one will go to the polls on the 27th.
But one thing was clear from the outset. Come what may, free, fair and inclusive elections were to go ahead. But who was going to run these elections? Given the country's history of oppression, a new body or agency with no links to the existing government and broadly representative of South African society had to be formed. So it was that the Independent Electoral Commission, or IEC, first came into being. And on the eve of the Christmas of 1993, the chairperson of the new body, Judge Johan Kriegler, would meet with his deputy, then Advocate Dikgang Moseneke, and 9 other South African commissioners to chart the way forward. None had electoral experience and had just under 4 months to pull off an election that would normally take 2 years to put together.
It was a political imperative that the elections take place. The date, the 27th of April, had assumed magical proportions. That would be the day, come hell or high water, the elections would take place as determined on that date.
But the country was on a knife edge. Members of the far right-wing AWB were going around the country destabilizing political gatherings and propagating white supremacist ideas. Violent clashes between the ANC and the IFP were becoming more commonplace as they tried to campaign in each other's strongholds. The violence was further fueled by the Third Force, a secret operative within the South African Security Force, which provided arms and military training to some sectors of the IFP. Over 3,700 people were killed in the political violence of 1993. Throwing a spanner to the works was the multi-party negotiations, a forum between the governing National Party, the African National Congress, and other political parties. During the talks, the main negotiating parties, the ANC and the NP, had reached an agreement on a number of issues before taking them to the other parties in the forum. This put considerable pressure on the other parties to either agree with the consensus or to be left out of the process. In protest, the leader of the Inkatha Freedom Party, Mangosuthu Buthelezi, pulled out of the talks and threatened to boycott the elections. Unless, however, King Goodwill Zwelithini was guaranteed special status of the Zulu monarchy and the party granted complete autonomy over the internal politics of KwaZulu. And with the IFP out, the negotiations continued under a cloud of political uncertainty. Then on the 10th of April 1993, the unthinkable would happen. Chris Hani, leader of the South African Communist Party and a senior leader of the ANC, was assassinated outside of his home in Dornpark by a Polish far-right-wing immigrant, Janusz Walus. Emotions ran high as fears of a violent backlash swelled throughout the country. But in a message regarded as presidential even before he was president, Nelson Mandela went on national television and called for calm. The call helped to tip the scales in favor of the ANC in the negotiations. Then on the 25th of June 1993, in a bid to derail the talks, members of the AWB dramatically stormed the World Trade Center in Kempton Park, where the negotiations were taking place. They broke through the glass front of the building with an armored vehicle and briefly took over the negotiations chamber. the climate of violence would continue into 1994.
In the last months leading up to the election, there were reportedly as many as 10,000 people killed in related violence. There were bombs going off, bombs at what is now Oliver Tambo International Airport, a bomb in downtown Johannesburg, homeland leaders refusing to come into the process. Things were very, very tense.
And with barely a week to go before the elections, the IFP decided to register the party. But the ballot papers had already been printed, so a contingency plan had to be devised. Stickers of the party had to be hastily affixed by hand at the bottom of each ballot paper. It was a costly exercise, but one that would ensure a 95% voter turnout on election day. Then came the 27th of April 1994. A day that would formally mark an end to apartheid. The election was going to be an African election for Africans and by Africans, and because most of the voters were going to be voting for the first time, there was simply no common voters' roll to speak of.
Our first task was to ensure that every citizen of this nation who's eligible to vote, who's 18 years of age, should be on the voters' roll before they vote. We had to demarcate the country into various units because we wanted to make sure that everyone is treated equally, because that's what the Constitution also says.
And as voting got underway, reports of long queues and shortages of voting materials started filtering through the media. But the euphoria in the air was nothing short of magical. There was no violence and only a few spoiled ballots were reported. On the day, over 19 million voters turned out for the historic poll.
South Africa is a very dynamic society, very vibrant. Politically, in all respect, we voice our views very strongly. But the interesting thing about South Africa is when it comes to elections, we come together. We go, we make sure that those elections are a success.
Rajesh Lechman is a coordinator for the National Social Welfare Forum and an ardent advocate for human rights. He remembers the big day with a sense of fondness.
I woke up really early that morning. I was excited to vote. I'd never voted before, and in the last kind of 10 years of my life before that day, a lot of what I'd learned was why it was important for me to be able to vote as a free citizen. And it was, I was really excited. For the first time, for me the symbolism was that I was actually a South African. I mean, I might have been South African before that, but I didn't have sort of the legal status of being a South African. I didn't have universal franchise with my fellow countrymen.
Paul Wandberg was the official photographer for the IEC at the time.
The most remarkable moment for me was not so much my own voting, but witnessing Nelson Mandela voting for the first time. And I was very nervous, actually. I took about 25 light meter readings just to make sure that I was correct. And then he came in eventually and he voted. And I got a moment, yeah.
The miraculous elections saw Mandela, a former political prisoner, ascend to the presidency of the country. But the Transitional Executive Council, or TEC, which had effectively run the country in the run-up to the elections, had not made any provision in the legislation or in the Electoral Commission Act for what would happen after the elections. There was simply a gap. The IEC had only been mandated to run the 1994 elections and then ceased to exist thereafter.
I and a number of key senior staff members, with the consent of the whole 1994 Commission, decided that somebody had to see to the winding down of this exercise. We'd had some 300,000 people working, so we kept a small skeleton staff going. I stayed on, and some senior staff members stayed on, and we paid the bills, we collected the equipment, And then part and parcel of what this team did was we planned the continuation of an electoral agency in the country. And by the time the new IEC was established in 1997, the foundations had been laid by this little continuation committee.
To date, all general and local government elections in South Africa have been deemed free and fair, a capability that has eluded a number of African states after the gaining of independence.
The first elections are often carried through by the enthusiasm of the moment. It's the second and third elections, when there's no longer the excitement of the honeymoon, that complacency sets in, apathy sets in, and it's a known problem. The indulgence that people are prepared to expend at the transitional liberation elections runs out, and you then are more likely to have problems at subsequent elections.
When we had that first voters' roll, that united all citizens of this nation, whether we are rich or poor, you appear on that voters' roll on the basis of the first letter of your last surname, of your surname. So if you are an A and you live in some corner in an informal settlement, some village, we don't even know you, you'll be top in the list. If you are a Z and you are the president, ZU, you're right at the bottom. So that's the fun of a democracy, because that's just what maybe really feel we've realized the value of what a democracy is: equality, human dignity, and fairness.
But sentiment alone was not going to be enough to sustain the miracle story. As a developing nation and a growing democracy, South Africa had no choice but to embrace innovative technology in the running of future elections.
We evolved a system of doing a voters' roll that was unique throughout the world, working on a GPS system, working closely with the national census in organizing constituencies and voters registration areas linked to the national census areas, which made it possible to locate people not by addresses but by their physical location on the globe at certain coordinates, which was an enormous breakthrough. We have a voters' roll that functions well. So I'm particularly proud of how we did the voters' roll. I'm particularly proud of the technique of registration and voting, recording of people having gone through the vote by means of the zip machine.
If we had not had those machines, we would not have been able to get 15 million people on a voters' roll in one weekend. And then we finished with the rest. I think it was about 2 million and so on, because I think the first elections we had about 18 million citizens in the voters' roll, and that all end. And using that technology, we were able to compile the voters roll in a very short space of time.
The successes would continue with subsequent elections. For example, the second democratic elections were prepared and delivered in the record time of 13 months, and to date, the IEC has over 25 million registered voters in its voters' roll. But electoral success over the past 20 years has not necessarily translated into a better life for all. Widespread poverty and inequality remain South Africa's biggest challenges.
Based on our 7th Economic and Social Rights Report, there are certain components of economic and social rights which seem to be moving backward and retrogressing in many respects. Particularly access to sanitation and clean water have been identified as particular problems. The housing situation in South Africa has still not been fully addressed. And we noticed that maternal mortality has increased significantly since 1990, and the child mortality levels are at the same level today as they were in 1990. And this reflects a retrogression of those rights to socioeconomic rights in particular, whereas we are meant to be moving towards the progressive realization of socioeconomic rights. It appears as if we are taking a step backward.
Lucy Holborn, a social and economic researcher, feels that the country's transition from apartheid to democracy did bring some positive changes amid the challenges.
On the sort of political side of things, I think we've done well. Certainly in the initial transition period, there's enormous potential there for that to be quite violent, to be quite divided. And I think, you know, specific leaders such as Mandela, Desmond Tutu, those sorts of people were really pushed for those processes to be cohesive and to be as united as possible. So I think in that sense we've actually done really well. We've transitioned to a democracy very peacefully, bringing most people along with us, and that's really positive.
Considering South Africa's history of racial oppression, it's not surprising that South Africans continue to vote largely along racial lines.
Race remains a critical issue for all of us as South Africans. I remember traveling to the United States about 2 years ago. I lived there for a year, and because I had to fill out a social security form, one of the requirements in the form is to identify your race. And there were a couple of categories available, one of which was Hispanic, which I clearly wasn't, or white, which was one of the other categories. And then one of the last categories was black, which I ticked off because I clearly identify myself as a black person in the context of our democracy. We must openly talk about race and equality in South Africa. I think it's the only way that as a country we are able to move forward from the terrible past that we had all had to endure under apartheid.
Human rights activist Sipho Mantula agrees with Kayum's assessment of race in the country and feels it's an issue that needs to be explored not only from a past perspective, but also from a continually changing present.
Going forward is to say, how do we manage our emotions? How do we manage our understanding of different races? And generally, if you look at even this concept of colored, you find that it was an apartheid law creation of 1950 where it was taming people colors, and there was no even a clear meaning of who is a colored person. But if you look at a generic meaning of colored people, they see themselves as indigenous people, they see themselves as the First Nation people, they see themselves as Africans.
Lucy believes the country's tough economic climate does play a role in exacerbating our racial divides.
Increasingly the divisions aren't strictly racial, they're actually between class groups. They're between the unemployed, they're between the low-skilled workers, they're between the sort of economic elite. And those, I think, increasingly are the sort of divisions that people feel in their day-to-day lives. They see so-and-so living in this way, and it's such a different experience of life that, you know, it affects our cohesiveness as a society. It affects how we can relate to each other and understand each other. There are lots of other issues in society